The euro is in danger. No, this is not clickbait. You know that sometimes we are the bearers of bad news, but on Visualeconomik, we don't like to go around proclaiming the apocalypse. Nevertheless, this does not detract from the fact that the euro is a much weaker currency than it seems at first glance. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking, but let's see, the euro crisis is over. 10 years ago, the situation was much worse, and in the end, nothing happened. Now this is true, but let me tell you two things. Number one, the euro did not emerge unscathed from the 2008 crisis and the sovereign debt crisis that followed. It emerged with scars that are now being reopened. And number two, the current situation has nothing to do with that of 2012. These days, the European driving force, Germany, is running slower than Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin, and it doesn't look like things are going to improve anytime soon. And what about the number two European economy, France? Well, you have Macron and his prime minister who didn't even last a year in office. But pay attention because this is not the end of the problems. New parties such as AfD in Germany, which are rapidly gaining support, are shaking the foundations of the political project of the European Union itself. What would happen to the euro if the European Union ultimately fails? That's the big question. Could the euro really disappear? How close are we really? Let's take a look. It seems that the euro is too big to fall, even though it's only 25 years old. We're talking about the most ambitious monetary project in history. A project which, as we can see, has been a complete success. Never before has Europe had a couple of decades with such high price stability. I don't know about you, but if I think about what would happen to the currency of some countries if they were not in the euro, I start to tremble. And guess what? It's only natural that the euro has been so successful. From its founding, the architects of the system knew exactly what challenges they faced and designed mechanisms to avoid problems. The most obvious problem is that if two countries share currency, then in a way, they are intertwining their destinies. If one does very badly, so does the other. And not surprisingly, this creates the incentive for one country to spend like crazy, and then, when the going gets tough, wait for the other country to bail it out. How do you try to solve that? With a limit on the deficit that member countries can have, a limit of 3%. Well, guess how long it took a country to break it? Just 4 years. And not just any country, but France and Germany. And let's see, the deficit was not too severe, but something very striking happened here. The ECB did not apply any sanction. The reason?
Asked why the Commission, on several occasions, had turned a blind eye to French infractions, Juncker admitted that it did so because it is France.
Let's see who can stand up to the giants. But despite this detail, the euro still had a bomb-proof design. The best example is the triple lock. On the one hand, the European Central Bank is strictly forbidden from buying public debt directly from member countries. This could be called the anti-Peronism clause, because it basically prevents governments from using the banknote printing machine to finance the festivities of democracy. On the other hand, there is the anti-rescue clause. No member of the monetary union will have to take over the problems of another member. Obviously, members can support each other, but the ECB will not bail out any bankrupt country that does not provide financial guarantees. And finally, what we've already mentioned, the deficit limit. If these three clauses were to be summarized in a single line, it would be the ECB's official mandate to ensure price stability through monetary policy. The central bank is not there to rescue governments or anything like that. The only thing it has to do is to control inflation. With these three things, they ensured that no government would get too clever and try to take advantage of others. So, what's the problem? The problem is that the triple lock is designed to prevent a government from spending wildly and going bankrupt. Now, what happens if a government, even with the triple lock in place, does go bankrupt? Well, according to the founding fathers of the euro, that is a mess that will be solved by those in power when the time comes. And we're not saying this is a joke. Back when this was created, this situation seemed so remote that they didn't even worry about it. But then came the 2008 crisis. During this crisis, the governments skirted the deficit limit. After that, the ECB started with a type of program that would be repeated a lot in other years, the FTOs, short for fine-tuning operations. The idea is very simple. If a bank was in trouble because, for example, it had granted mortgages that it was now unclear whether they would be repaid, they could borrow money from the European Central Bank. The ECB would give much more favorable loans than these banks would find in the market. However, this created two big problems. The first is that the proportion of of lending between banks dropped tremendously. Now everybody was going to the central bank, and that made the financial network much more centralized. Now do you remember that rule that said that the central bank could not buy the debt of member countries? Here comes the biggest problem of all. Banks are one of the main buyers of government debt in the primary market, and by bailing them out, indirectly, the governments of the day were also bailed out. That is, the central bank bailed out a bank, but then that bank took the money and lent it to the indebted governments. In other words, an indirect banknote printing machine. However, the worst was yet to come. The 2008 crisis was followed by the sovereign debt crisis. Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Italy had their public accounts in tatters. And do you remember that the architects of the euro believed it was unthinkable for a member state to go bankrupt? Well, sometimes life comes along and gives you a double dose of something you didn't even want. In the end, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland were bailed out in exchange for committing to austerity reforms, the famous Men in Black. Of course, this bailout was made by the European Commission, not the central bank. Even so, Spain and Italy said that austerity would be discussed at a later date, if necessary. And if you add to this the fact that Greece was not clear whether it was going to accept the reforms or leave the common currency, you will surely understand why this episode became known as the Euro Crisis. We came very close to losing the European currency. However, on 26th of July 2012, something happened that changed everything. The president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, gave a speech assuring that he would do whatever it took to save the euro, even if it meant bypassing the triple lock that the ECB had.
The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
The result? Well, it was a success. In theory, risk premiums plummeted. The interest rate on the Greek bond went from 25% to 5% in just 8 years. And although it is hardly noticeable in this graph, Spain and Italy fell to a third of what they had been before Draghi pronounced the magic words. This was probably the best thing that could have happened, but it didn't come for free. From this point on, the ECB adopted a much more aggressive set of policies, and it became clear that the triple lock was more of a suggestion than an obligation. On top of that, as if this were not enough, which I assure you it is not, the ECB began to use an increasingly broad definition of its charter. For example, the central bank could not subsidize the banks, but here it did so, and in a much more savage way than during the 2008 crisis. It could not buy debt from countries, but it did so indirectly through the banks. The reason? Because it was necessary for guaranteeing price stability. Draghi made it very clear.
The issue is not whether there is a subsidy or not. There is a subsidy. The issue is whether the TLTRO fulfills monetary policy objectives.
The question is, where do we draw the line? Because, for instance, in 2021, Christine Lagarde signed the Climate Change Action Plan. And what does climate change have to do with monetary policy? Well, if there is suddenly a big drought, well, that affects the price of potatoes and, therefore, inflation. In practice, the central bank now has a free hand to make whatever policy it wants and to interfere in whatever matters it wants to based on subjective criteria. With this logic, I suppose Lagarde could send a group of mercenaries to clear the Gulf Strait of Houthis to lower the price of crude oil, for example. And as you can imagine, after COVID, the Ukrainian war, and the European slowdown, this has only gotten worse. The central bank is no longer as independent as it was designed to be. During the pandemic, the ECB bypassed all its constraints and bought lots of government debt at sky-high rates, and without demanding anything in return. And don't get me wrong, Europe is not Argentina, but it is essential that you understand that the euro is becoming more and more a political issue rather than an economic one, and therefore it is currently more vulnerable to things that, if they had happened in 2005, wouldn't have even tickled it. But before I go on, let me give you another example of how far the influence of politics has reached in the central bank. In mid-2020, when the pandemic was already starting to take its toll and the debt of some countries was starting to rise, Christine Lagarde literally said that the ECB would use maximum flexibility, but that the mission of the European Central Bank was not to close government debt spreads. The next day, Italian bonds had their worst day in history, worse than at any time during the 2008 crisis. The market was so convinced that the ECB would act if there were problems that they had already discounted the price of Italian bonds, thinking that there would be some kind of bailout. Lagarde wasted no time. She put an asterisk in the transcript of her interview, saying that she was fully prepared to avoid the fragmentation of the euro, and gave yet another interview the same day clarifying that she was just as committed to whatever it takes as Mario Draghi himself. What's more, do you remember that during the sovereign debt crisis, bailouts were approved for Greece, Portugal, and Ireland, but those bailouts were highly conditional on reforms? Well, that is the logical thing to do. The thing is, have the same reforms been demanded following the pandemic? Not at all. The response to the pandemic topic has been next generation funds, which are such a terrible thing that we will surely dedicate an exclusive video to them on this channel. For now, the only thing you need to know is that it is money that is arriving very, very late, and it is basically going to finance total rubbish. In theory, this money would be used to finance investments so profitable that there would be no need for further reforms because the money would fall from the sky, but the result has been a disaster. Conclusion: Europe no longer has the authority to demand reforms. The next generation funds are a bailout, a way for the rich countries, which the press dubbed as the evil, frugal countries, to pay the debts of the most wasteful. And what do you want me to say? This is to be expected. In Europe, there is no one left with the authority to demand reforms from the rest of the countries. During the 2008 crisis, Germany was a driving force that clearly had the political and economic authority to tell the rest what to do. Today, however, the Bundesbank estimates that Germany has already entered its stagnation period, which could last 10 years. In fact, it estimates 2% growth over 8 years, starting in 2020. And no, we don't mean that Germany is only growing 2% each year, but that will be its total growth over the entire period. Being clear, that's an unprecedented disaster. No wonder the German government is already completely broken. The traffic light coalition has been a failure, and we already have early elections scheduled for 23rd of February. The critical point came when the leader of the liberal pro-market party, well, pro-market should be put in a lot of quotation marks, but the closest thing they have, signed a letter to Olaf Scholz, in which he basically said that he was a socialist hippie, and that Germany had to abandon some of the green policies and move towards a model with less government. The result? Well, this letter is known as the divorce letter, so you can imagine. But Germany is not the only problem. I'm sure you've heard that the French government is also on its last legs, and Macron has also lost a vote of confidence motion. These days, France is the country with the highest deficit in the 27-member club, and the worst of it all is that in its original budget, it did not intend to bring it to meet the European limit of 3% until 2029. And on top of that, the government was overthrown because the other parties considered this adjustment too brutal. We must also bear in mind that all governments are now much more indebted than during the 2008 crisis, so their room for maneuver is much smaller. And at this point, I'm going to get a little more serious. The two largest European economies are terminally ill and do not seem likely to improve in the next 5 years. And the other two largest economies, Spain and Italy, only appear to be growing because their GDP is on more steroids than a bodybuilder. What is clear is that if the central bank wants to take action, it will have to intervene as it has never done before. And we're sorry to say this, but no, whatever it takes is going to work this time, for two reasons. The first is that Europe's problems are not financial, they are structural. The Bundesbank makes this very clear in the report from which we have taken the last graph. And if problems are structural, then no matter how much the central bank lowers interest rates to give the economy a shot of adrenaline, as it's already doing, it's not going to solve the problem. In fact, it could even make it worse, financing even more ruinous investments that leave less capital available for those that are really needed. But there is another reason. The problem is no longer a country of 10 million inhabitants like Greece, but the largest economies in Europe, the most populous, and also some of the richest. In other words, the poorest or smallest countries would have to make a brutal sacrifice to rescue France and Germany, and this is politically impossible. Euroscepticism is the order of the day. During the 2008 crisis, there were parties calling for leaving the euro. Yes, but nothing compared to what we have today. I'm sure I don't have to give you any examples, but here is a news item from the second strongest German political force.
Far-right leader wants Germany to perform its own Brexit.
In short, the central bank's ability to act is shrinking, and if it does act, it will raise such great opposition that some countries may opt out of the euro. And we have given you a news item from Germany, but perhaps it's more likely that some smaller country that does not want to pick up the tab for the rest of the countries, such as Austria, where the FPO, another Eurosceptic party, is already the #1 political force, will leave. 20 years ago, a country going bankrupt or leaving the euro would not be a definite threat to the common currency, but these days, things are very different. If nobody does anything, then the euro will become a worse and worse currency, because the countries backing it will become worse and worse countries. But if the ECB tries to fix it, Euroscepticism could take a stronger hold, and that would also be the end of the euro, but it doesn't look great in either scenario. At this point, the question is no longer whether the euro will survive or not, but how long it will manage to hold on. Let's hope that the necessary reforms are taken before it's too late. But at this point, it's your turn. Did you know how the European Central Bank's policy has been evolving? Do you think it will act to try to resuscitate France and Germany? And if so, can it do so without the other countries flatly refusing to cooperate? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.